Today we're diving into a story that's as wild as any Hollywood movie, except it's 100% real. In January 2015, the United States Department of Justice indicted two American citizens, accusing them of violating the Neutrality Act. Their crime? Conspiring to overthrow the government of a foreign country without the approval of the US government. The two men on trial were Cherno Njie, a 57-year-old real estate developer from Texas, and Papa Fall, a 46-year-old retired US military officer. Together, they formed a small group with one goal: to stage a coup and take over the leadership of a country where they planned to install themselves as president. Their total budget for this grand plan? A whopping $220,000. And the country they wanted to overthrow? A small, little-known African nation with a population of fewer than 3 million, the Gambia. Now, some of you might have heard of the Gambia, but chances are you don't know much about it. This tiny country is full of stories that could fill books, or in our case, YouTube episodes. The Gambia is located on the western coast of Africa, along the Atlantic Ocean. It's a sliver of land, just over 11,000 square kilometers in size, with a population of about 2.5 million people. To put that into perspective, it's about the same size as Albania, and is one of the smallest countries on the African continent. The capital, Banjul, is the political, economic, and cultural hub of the country. In 2016, Banjul had a population of just over 31,000 people, so not exactly bustling by global standards. The Gambia's existence is largely the result of colonial border drawing between the British and French. The country stretches along the Gambia River, wedged into the territory of its much larger neighbor, Senegal. Now, the Gambia isn't exactly a resource-rich nation. In fact, it's dirt poor. Its main export is peanuts, which account for about half of the country's GDP. And since Senegal isn't exactly in dire need of peanuts for snacks, there's never been much incentive for them to invade. So, the Gambia has just kind of existed. In 1965, the Gambia gained independence and welcomed its first president, Dawda Jawara. Jawara was not only the country's first president but also its first veterinarian. Yes, you heard that right, veterinarian. Now don't let the vet degree fool you into underestimating him. Jawara wasn't just any vet. He earned a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Edinburgh. And in a country where even high school graduates were hard to come by, a vet with a PhD was practically a prophet. Jawara had spent years in the UK and was well versed in Western political systems. So when the Gambia needed a leader, it was only natural that the presidency fell into his lap. When the Gambia first became independent, there weren't many qualified people to run the government. So Jawara not only served as president, but also took on the roles of Minister of Defense, Foreign Affairs, Internal Affairs, and Information, as well as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Essentially, he ran the whole show by himself. Jawara did try to reform the economy, but his efforts didn't go very far. To win back public support, he started using his veterinary skills to treat livestock across the country. This earned him some goodwill, but beyond that, his achievements were few and far between. Jawara, eager to show off his knowledge of Western politics, introduced a multi-party system. In Banjul, a city of just 30,000 people, there were not only Jawara's ruling party but also 3 opposition parties, 3 underground parties, and several grassroots political organizations. For such a small population, that's a lot of political activity. At first it seemed like a token gesture, but in 1981, things took a dramatic turn. While Jawara was abroad attending the wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, a coup attempt was launched back home in the Gambia. At the time, the Gambia didn't have a standing army, just a police force of about 1,200 officers, and more than 400 of them joined the coup. The vice president led the remaining loyal police forces in a bloody battle against the rebels. Jawara, hearing the news while abroad, immediately called for help from Senegal, the Gambia's big brother. Senegal sent in troops, and the coup was eventually crushed, but not before hundreds of people were killed, and Banjul's commercial district was left in ruins. After the 1981 coup attempt, Jawara realized that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and decided that the Gambia needed its own military. So, in 1984, the Gambia finally established its national army, with a grand total of 800 soldiers. With his 800-strong army, Jawara felt more confident on the international stage. His first target? The Soviet Union. Now, the Gambia and the USSR had a bit of a history. Jawara wasn't exactly a fan of Soviet imperialism. In 1980, during a speech at the United Nations, Jawara famously flipped the bird at Leonid Brezhnev, declaring that the Gambia could wipe the Soviet Union off the map in just 3 days. Brezhnev, reportedly terrified, walked away in silence. A few years later, in 1985, the Gambia, now broke, asked the Soviet Union for financial aid. But the USSR, dealing with its own economic problems under Mikhail Gorbachev, couldn't offer much. Jawara, furious, threatened to conquer the entire Soviet Union within 7 days. In the end, the Gambia's threats apparently worked, because just a few years later the Soviet Union collapsed. Coincidence? Maybe. But the Gambia had clearly made its mark on history. With the USSR out of the picture, the Gambia found itself in a unique position. To keep its military sharp, the Gambia sent troops to Liberia for peacekeeping missions. But these foreign ventures drained the country's already limited finances. After a few years of military adventurism, the Gambia's government couldn't even pay its soldiers. As history has shown, armies that don't get paid tend to cause problems. And in 1994, led by a young army officer named Yahya Jammeh, the Gambia's military staged a coup. In a lightning-fast operation, they stormed Banjul, and Jawara, hearing the news, fled to safety aboard a US Navy ship. The coup was a complete success, with almost no resistance. After 30 years in power, Jawara found that no one was willing to fight for his regime. It was a harsh realization. The real clown was me all along. The Gambia, under Jammeh's rule, was a country in dire straits. Life expectancy was just 45 years, infant mortality was at 13%, child mortality was at 29%, and 75% of the population was illiterate. 3/4 of the population lived below the poverty line, and the country was riddled with corruption. Jammeh's coup was swift and relatively easy, largely because the country was in such a terrible state. And so began the Jammeh era. Jammeh was a man who made Muammar Gaddafi look like a reasonable leader. At just 29 years old, he became the president of the Gambia. And let's be honest, how many of us were running countries at 29? Born in 1965 in a rural village, Jammeh was a bright student and passed his high school exams with flying colors. He joined the Gambian military at 19 and quickly rose through the ranks. But unlike most soldiers, Jammeh had a passion for justice. In his younger years, he would hitch rides in Banjul, only to berate government ministers for their corruption once they picked him up. After the 1994 coup, Jammeh and a few other officers formed a military government, with Jammeh appointing himself as president. The West, particularly the US and Europe, were not pleased. In response, they imposed sanctions on the Gambia. Jammeh, of course, wasn't happy about this. In 1995, he threatened to send the Gambian Expeditionary Force to conquer Europe. Then, in 2002, after realizing that the US still had sanctions in place, he upped the ante, vowing to invade North America. The US, clearly shaken, downgraded its diplomatic relations with the Gambia. To back up his threats, Jammeh embarked on a military buildup. He expanded the army by 20%, growing it from 800 soldiers to a staggering 1,000. He also transformed the Gambia's military into a multi-branch force, complete with an army, navy, and air force. In 1996, the Gambia established its navy, which boasted 70 sailors and 2 gunboats. Later, the fleet expanded to include 4 patrol boats. The Air Force? Well, it consisted of 3 planes. One was a MiG-25 gifted by Georgia, which never flew again after it arrived in the Gambia. The other 2 planes were crop dusters. But hey, even the mighty US Air Force can't shoot down a plane that never takes off, right? The Army didn't have any tanks, but it did have 20 armored personnel carriers and 1 howitzer. And while the artillery might have been lacking, Jammeh made up for it with his love of rocket launchers. His presidential bodyguards carried rocket launchers everywhere, even keeping one in the trunk of his car, just in case. At its peak, the Gambia's military budget reached a staggering $3 million a year. Jammeh's threats were taken seriously enough that, in 2007, U.S. President George W. Bush invited him to visit the White House. During their meeting, Jammeh claimed that if tensions escalated in the Taiwan Strait, the Gambia could send its 1,000-strong Marine Corps to completely neutralize China's military efforts. Not content with that, he also promised to bring peace to the Middle East and defeat al-Qaeda, all in a day's work. In 2011, Jammeh visited the U.S. again, this time meeting with President Obama. Jammeh advised Obama that the U.S. military strategies were outdated and that they should adopt the Gambia's advanced tactics. He also upped his previous offer, stating that the Gambia could send 2,000 Marines to not only stop China, but also wipe out the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Obama, no doubt impressed, agreed to a joint military exercise with the Gambia later that year. The U.S. military, it seems, had a lot to learn. But Jammeh wasn't just a military genius, he was also a healer. In 2007 he announced that he had received divine inspiration from his ancestors, giving him the ability to cure asthma and AIDS. He began holding weekly clinics at the National Assembly building, treating AIDS on Mondays and Thursdays, and asthma on Fridays and Saturdays. His method? Placing his hands under the patients' heads until they were cured. It was essentially faith healing, Gambian style. And while the World Health Organization criticized his methods, Jammeh dismissed their concerns, insisting that his treatments were based on Qigong, an ancient Gambian medical practice. Jammeh's powers didn't stop there. He also launched a witch hunt across the country after his aunt died unexpectedly, believing that witches were to blame. He rounded up over 1,000 women, subjecting them to forced confessions and herbal cures. It was a medieval nightmare in the 21st century. On top of that, Jammeh threatened to behead all LGBTQ+ individuals and adopted a shoot-first-ask-questions-later policy for handling criminals. While Jammeh might not have had the academic credentials of his predecessor, Jawara, he certainly had a way with words. Whenever he was upset about something, he would declare that he had zero tolerance for it. And when he was really upset, he'd declare double zero tolerance, though he never seemed to grasp that 0 times 2 is still 0. Under Jammeh's iron-fisted rule, the Gambia became a place of fear. His reign lasted for over 20 years, but in 2014, an unexpected event would shake the foundations of Gambian politics. In 2013, Lamin Sane, a former Gambian military officer, fled to the United States. Sane, in his mid-30s, had been a rising star in the Gambia's military and had even trained in the United Kingdom. Upon his return, Jammeh had appointed him as the head of the Presidential Guard, responsible for protecting the president himself. Sane took his job seriously, but in Jammeh's world, loyalty was never enough. One day, after refusing to shoot his own men for no reason, Sane was deemed disloyal and removed from his post. Sensing danger, he fled the country with his family and settled in Baltimore in 2013. But even in the United States, Sane couldn't shake his desire to overthrow Jammeh. He believed that the only way to end Jammeh's brutal rule was through violence, and he had the experience to make it happen. Sane contacted a Gambian political dissident living in the United States who, in turn, introduced him to Cherno Njie, the Texas real estate developer. Njie, a Gambian American who had lived in the United States for over 20 years, was still deeply connected to his homeland. When he heard about Sane's plan, he didn't hesitate. "You do the work and I'll fund it," Njie promised. Of course, Njie wasn't just offering money out of the goodness of his heart, he had a dream of his own to become the interim president of the Gambia after Jammeh was overthrown. It seems that real estate developers everywhere have presidential ambitions. True to his word, Njie put up $220,798 to fund Sane's coup. Now, most of us would probably use that kind of money to buy a house or a new car. But Njie? He saw it as his ticket to the presidency. Talk about thinking big. With the money in place, Sane quickly assembled a team, which included Gambian exiles and a few retired United States military personnel. They formed a group called the Gambian Freedom League, dedicated to toppling Jammeh. Sane even created a detailed PowerPoint presentation outlining the plan, which he shared with the team via Google Drive. Their strategy had two main components. One, Attack Jammeh's motorcade while he was traveling, either capturing or killing him and then seizing control of the country. 2. Storm the presidential palace and take control of the government. Now here's the catch. The team only had about a dozen people. Even though the Gambia is a small country, its military and police forces still numbered in the thousands. So how did Sane plan to pull this off? Sane was confident that, once the shooting started, the Gambian military would defect to his side. He believed that his former colleagues in the military would abandon Jammeh and join him in the coup. In fact, he was so sure of this that he didn't even plan for much resistance. Sane also believed that he could recruit 160 soldiers from the Gambian military academy to help him carry out the plan. In hindsight, this plan was full of holes. But in the context of African coup history, it was actually one of the more well-thought-out schemes. After all, Jammeh's own coup in 1994 had been planned just one night before it was executed. As the team was finalizing their plans, a new member joined the group. Papa Fall, a Gambian American and former United States soldier who had served in Afghanistan. Fall also had a personal connection to Gambian politics. He was the grandnephew of Dawda Jawara, the country's first president. Fall's military experience and family ties made him a valuable addition to the team, and he quickly became one of its key members. With Fall on board, the team was complete. Sane would handle recruitment and planning, Fall would take charge of the military operation, and Njie would provide the funds, and of course wait to be crowned president. The team held twice-weekly conference calls to discuss the details of the operation. They printed out Google Maps satellite images of the presidential palace, labeled them top secret, and sealed them in envelopes. We're not sure why they bothered with the secrecy, given that anyone with an internet connection could find the same images in seconds. But hey, they were taking this seriously. They also created a Word document listing all the equipment they needed. The shopping list included 28 rifles, 8 pistols, 4 machine guns, and 15 scopes. They also noted that they could use 2.50 caliber sniper rifles, though these weren't strictly necessary. Luckily for them, it wasn't too difficult to gather these supplies in the United States. Fall packed the guns into plastic barrels, covered them with blankets, and shipped them to the Gambia via commercial airlines. By late October 2014, the team members began flying to the Gambia. But when they arrived, Sane was in for a nasty surprise. Many of the mercenaries and Gambian recruits he had counted on didn't show up. Some claimed they were sick, others said they were dealing with personal issues, and one even blamed his mother-in-law for confiscating his passport. In the end, the team that was supposed to number over 30 people was reduced to just 11, and of those, only 6 or 7 were ready to fight. Sane had hoped to recruit 160 soldiers from the Gambian military, but after working his contacts, he managed to recruit just 1 soldier, and a presidential bodyguard who agreed to feed him information about Jammeh's movements. The team learned that Jammeh would be leaving the country shortly after Christmas. They planned to attack his motorcade on December 26th, but at the last minute, Jammeh changed his plans. Instead of leaving in the early morning, he would be flying out at 10 a.m. in broad daylight. Without the cover of darkness, Sane's team decided to abandon the motorcade attack and let Jammeh leave the country. That left them with only one option, Plan B, storm the presidential palace. Most of the team thought this was a suicide mission. After all, how could a handful of men hope to take on the entire Gambian military and police force? But Sane was determined. They had come this far and they weren't going to turn back now. On the night of December 30th, 2014, at 1 a.m., the team gathered in a cemetery about a mile from the presidential palace. They chose the location because, well, no one likes to hang out in cemeteries at night, so the chances of being spotted were low. Sane divided the team into 2 groups. Group A would attack the front gate, while Group B, led by Fall, would hit the rear entrance. There was supposed to be a Group C to provide backup, but with so few men, they had to scrap that plan. With everything in place, the 2 cars left the cemetery and headed toward the palace. Group A successfully made it into the courtyard, where they were spotted by a guard. Sane and one of his men tried to convince the guard to surrender, but before they could even get a word out, the guard opened fire, killing Sane on the spot. The rest of Group A panicked and fled. Meanwhile, Group B, led by Fall, was still searching for a parking spot when they heard gunfire. Unsure of what was happening, they parked the car only to be met with a hail of bullets. One of Fall's men was killed, and Fall quickly realized the mission was a bust. He and the remaining team member fled. The entire coup attempt was over in minutes. Not a single Gambian soldier or guard was harmed, and the rebels didn't even manage to return fire. Banjul immediately went into lockdown. Gambian soldiers conducted house-to-house searches, rounding up suspects. Some were arrested, others were killed. Back in the US, Njie was still waiting for news of their victory, dreaming of his future as president. But for Fall, the dream was over. He took refuge in a brothel, where he convinced a local resident to swap clothes with him. Disguised, he took a taxi to Dakar, where he crossed paths with a Gambian soldier who shared the ride with him. Fall pretended to sleep the whole way, terrified of being recognized. By the time Fall reached Dakar, it was midnight on December 31st. He immediately went to the US Embassy and turned himself in, confessing everything to embassy officials and CIA agents. "You know this is illegal, right?" one official asked. "I know," Fall replied, "but if I don't turn myself in, Jammeh's men will catch up with me, and it won't be pretty." In the aftermath of the failed coup, several American citizens were arrested and put on trial, facing charges of violating the Neutrality Act and illegally possessing weapons. They were looking at sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in prison. And so, this grand scheme to overthrow a government ended not with a bang but with a whimper. The whole thing was, frankly, a joke. Ironically, the coup didn't weaken Jammeh's regime, it strengthened it. He used the opportunity to launch a purge, cracking down on opposition parties and dissenters. But among the diplomats in Banjul, there was a sense that Jammeh's days were numbered. They said that eventually someone would succeed in toppling him. What no one expected was that it wouldn't be a military coup that brought down Jammeh, it would be a peaceful election. 1 year after the failed coup, the Gambia held its 2016 presidential election, the fourth election under Jammeh's rule. By this point, elections in the Gambia were little more than a formality. Jammeh's opponents were either imprisoned or assassinated, and those who did run posed no real threat. But this time, Jammeh faced a new challenger, Adama Barrow, a 51-year-old political novice. Barrow was an unknown figure in Gambian politics, but he had the backing of 8 opposition parties, which helped him secure the nomination. Barrow, like Jammeh, was born in 1965, but unlike Jammeh, he came from a relatively privileged background. After finishing high school, Barrow worked as a security guard in the UK while studying business management. He once even tackled a shoplifter during his time as a security guard. In 2002, Barrow returned to West Africa and started his own real estate company. The business was successful, but Barrow soon realized that selling houses wouldn't save the Gambia. With unemployment at 38% and poverty at 85%, he decided to enter politics. Barrow's presidential campaign was a long shot, but Jammeh didn't take him seriously. Jammeh mocked Barrow's past as a security guard, dismissing him as a nobody. There were no reliable polls in the Gambia, so Jammeh had no idea how much support Barrow had. Barrow's campaign was largely grassroots, with his supporters taking to the streets to spread the word, often just shouting to get people's attention. On election day, voters didn't use paper ballots. With a literacy rate of just 25%, the Gambia had a unique voting system. Each voter was given a glass marble, which they would drop into a drum with the picture of their chosen candidate. The sound of the marble hitting the drum was how votes were counted. To prevent tampering, all vehicles were banned from approaching the polling stations. In December 2016, the election results were announced. To everyone's shock, Barrow won with 45.5% of the vote, defeating Jammeh, who received 37.7%. Jammeh, stunned by the loss, initially conceded defeat. But a few days later he changed his mind, declaring the results invalid and calling for a new election. However, the international community had had enough of Jammeh's antics. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, assembled a military coalition to pressure Jammeh into stepping down. Senegal's president even helped Barrow hold his inauguration in Dakar. Faced with overwhelming pressure, Jammeh finally relented. On January 21, 2017, he agreed to step down and went into exile in Equatorial Guinea, where he announced plans to focus on farming. And so, The dream of becoming president that Cherno Njie couldn't achieve was finally realized by another real estate developer, Adama Barrow. With Jammeh gone, the Gambia entered a new era. The country was still poor, but there was hope on the horizon. In addition to agriculture, tourism became a growing industry. Interestingly, the Gambia's tourism appeal wasn't just about the beaches, it was about the people. For many older women from Europe, the Gambia became a popular destination for a different kind of tourism. Much like how some men travel to Southeast Asia, European women, particularly from the UK, flocked to the Gambia to enjoy the company of young local men. The country became a sort of black stallion ranch for European women seeking fun in the sun. As for Barrow, while his political foundations were still shaky, he was at least a normal leader, with a genuine desire to improve the country. Under his leadership, relations with China improved, and there was hope that the Gambia might finally see some progress. And that's where we'll leave this story for today. If you enjoyed this true tale from history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. See you next time.